Yes, thank you very much for coming, Nick Shannon. It's a pleasure to hear you again. Today's topic is applying dialectical thinking to resolve paradoxes in organizations. We're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bernard. So let me just see if I can share the screen. Hopefully that is working.
Perfect.
Except I can't see it myself because I've got some horrible Zoom window in the way, which I'm just trying to get rid of. Ah, it's gone. Okay, still good? Still visible? So,
Yeah.
so what I'm going to do today is just kind of walk you through the bones of the chapter I wrote for the Routledge International Handbook of Dialectical Thinking some while ago now, but it's still kind of quite fresh and hopefully will be of interest to you. I have to say that I don't think I could have written this without the help of Mike Mascolo, who was a very valuable companion on this particular journey doing the book. So here we go. And you could say that the inspiration for this particular chapter came from the idea that dialectical thinking is one way of resolving what people commonly look at as paradox in the world today. So we start with the paradox of the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. And clearly that is a kind of self-contradictory statement. But at the same time, I think what's interesting about it is that it is somehow meaningful. And we kind of understand it, even though it doesn't make sense. So there's something interesting about paradoxes just in that moment, in that sense. And another great form of inspiration to me has been Ian McGilchrist's work in The Matter with Things. He writes, at the origin of everything, there lies a coincidence of opposites that is profoundly generative, necessary for creation, and give rise to all we know. And so what I'm finding in my coaching work is that a lot of business people seem to, oh, if you could mute yourself, be helpful. A lot of people seem to kind of ignore paradoxes, or they don't really want to go there. It's as if they have to hang on to one side or the other in order to avoid the potential conflict that a paradox presents. And therefore, they miss out on the opportunity for kind of creative synthesis in their thinking. But I think that one of the things we can do is, by applying dialectical thinking, help people through that. So my story begins with this guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, who at one stage, I think in November 2022, was one of the wealthiest people in the world. And he went to pretty much one of the poorest within the space of about, well, 24 hours, actually. He lost something like $14.5 billion worth of his fortune. And what was interesting about Bankman-Fried was that he was seen as a kind of superstar philanthropist, as well as a whiz in the investment banking world. So what he'd done was established a cryptocurrency exchange, and at the same time he had a business which was speculating in cryptocurrencies. And of course, Bitcoin and the others had a tremendous run up prior to 2022. But then a hole appeared in Bankman-Fried's business model. And when a competitor of his refused to buy him out, everything kind of collapsed and Bitcoin went suddenly into reverse. I think it was up to about $67,000, and it went back down to about $15,000. A bit vague on that, but something like that. And Bankman Freud was pretty much made bankrupt. At the same time, when it came to kind of investigating his cryptocurrency exchange, the American authorities had him indicted for fraud, and he's since been charged with misappropriating billions of dollars, money laundering, overseeing an illegal campaign finance scheme, because he started financing the lavishing dollars on the Democratic and the Republican candidates. So when I wrote the chapter, he had just been released on bail, but he's since been sent down for something like 15 or 20 years. So he's going to spend decades in prison unless he gets off lightly. And ironically, if Bitcoin was trading where it is now, I think he would have been in the clear. Actually, he probably would have got away with it. So the question is, was he a genius? Was he a kind of hero? He was a proponent of the effective altruism movement. So he was saying, I'm going to make all this money and then I'm going to give it all away to good causes. Or was he a villain? And I think it's kind of very hard for a lot of people to get their minds around the idea that he could have been both. Now, in the academic business literature, there's been a growing body of exploration into the idea that business leaders are faced with paradoxes almost on a daily basis, and that successful leaders are the ones that can navigate these paradoxes. Managers face competing demands that simply can't be resolved just by hopping on one side of the fence with a let's take one or the other choice. So this literature has really been growing. I think it started with something like Gareth Morgan back in the 80s. And even before that, there's been repetitive themes, but it's kind of gathered steam in the last few years. And Marianne Lewis, around 2000, wrote a seminal article in the Academy of Management Review. And she defined a kind of model about how managers should deal with these paradoxes. She talked about them experiencing tensions of a kind of cognitively constructed polarity, which is to say that in their minds they saw opposites occurring between two different courses of action. And then they employed psychodynamic defenses to try and reduce the anxiety that these either or polarities seem to generate within them, and then found various ways, either successfully or unsuccessfully, to resolve, either by accepting them, confronting them, or somehow transcending them. And what was interesting about Marianne Lewis's ideas was that everyone became all of a sudden aware that actually there are an awful lot of constructed polarities, dichotomies, or opposites in business management. For example, do you go for making a choice between changing your organization or maintaining stability? And should you invest in new products or try and harvest the revenue from your existing products? You could say that British Petroleum, BP, has been a victim of the idea that they should move to renewable energy sources. It's all fallen apart, and now they've kind of retreated to just digging oil out of the ground. Should you go global or should you stay local? Another kind of strategic either-or decision that a lot of organizations face. Should you be product-driven or customer-driven? Should you develop your own products in a kind of Microsoft-like way or an Apple-like way, or should you go to your customers and see what they want more of? And then, of course, there's another set of opposites in terms of kind of how you run your organization, the sort of policies that you should adhere to. Should you compete with partners or collaborate? Compete with your competitive organizations, or should you collaborate? And should you have units within your organization that compete with each other, or should they collaborate? I'm working with a consultancy company at the moment. They're not clear about their strategy. They think they will need to, in order to grow, they will need to partner with their competitors, but then set themselves up with individual divisions, each operating in a different kind of competitive space. And they've kind of introduced competition between these groups within them. So they're both trying to partner with their competitors and then to compete internally, which doesn't really kind of make sense to me. It's a bit of a conflict. And then should you grow your existing talent, or should you buy talent from outside? And then more prosaically, should you work from home or have people going to the office? Another client of mine has ordered everyone back to the office, which has upset quite a few people, either because getting from home to the office is a hugely long commute, or in the meantime, while they've been working from home, they've forgotten to service their cars, and their cars no longer operate, and they can't actually get to the office physically. So one more set. How you go about managing people. Do you control your subordinates or do you empower them? Do you do stuff yourself or do you delegate? And then do you offer your direct reports challenge or do you find yourself supporting? Some of my coaching work is directed simply to helping managers work through those three dichotomies. So how do managers actually try and resolve these demands? Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the ancient Indian logic of the tetralemma, but you could say the Indians came up with 4 ways. And I've added a fifth to those. You can choose either A, or you can choose B. Or then you could say, well, it's a combination of both A and B. And then fourthly, you can say it's neither A and B. And of course, the fifth option is to say it's absolutely none of the above. All of that thinking is wrong. Well, what do we actually mean by a paradox? The word comes from the Greek. Paradox means contrary opinion. And there's something about a paradox being slightly absurd in terms of the contradiction. The most famous paradoxes are perhaps logical paradoxes. Here's the typical well-known liar's paradox. The next thing I say is true. The last thing I said is false. Here's the famous one of Zeno's arrow. So Zeno reasoned that an arrow at any single point in time is stationary. So its movement is defined by a whole set of stationary points, in which case, how does it actually move? Impossible to say. And then there's Achilles and the tortoise. If the tortoise has a head start and Achilles tries to catch it up, well, every time the tortoise moves forward, Achilles gets a little bit closer, but then the tortoise moves a bit further forward. So Achilles isn't quite there. So then he has to move a bit forward still, and then the tortoise has gone on even further. So how does Achilles ever overtake the tortoise? Well, absolutely all of these kind of defy common sense, really. Um, and in a way, you could argue that these kind of paradoxes are simply just plays on words. They're artifacts of language. In the literature, um, the definitions are a little bit vague. Um, Lewis cites the one from Ford and Backoff. Paradox is something that is constructed by individuals when oppositional tendencies are brought into recognizable proximity through reflection or interaction. And so they see that as a kind of mental construction, um, picking out opposites. They're a bit vague about what these opposites are. They call them tendencies. They talk about recognizable proximity. Um, it's a little bit woolly. Putnam later on added that paradoxes contain independent and mutually exclusive opposites that reflect back on and impose on each other. So a little bit more specific there. But I find all of these definitions a bit problematic. They talk about contradictions between polar opposites. They talked about how the elements of the paradox are interdependent, and they talk about how these paradoxes persist over time, but they don't really specify whether the paradox is something that's just purely mental or whether it's something that's real. So a paradox is just mental constructions, or is there some kind of ontological basis to them? And if you talk about them being interdependent, doesn't that mean that there must be some kind of ontological status between them? Or is the interdependence simply in the person's mind as a construction? And then, of course, the definition of opposites and contradictions is not particularly precise. We could say that north is the opposite of south, but is, for example, cat the opposite of dog? Well, in some people's sense, it might be, but in other people's sense, not at all. And then persistence over time. How long are we talking about, for example? And is this a matter for some paradoxes, but not others? So I think there's an element in which paradoxes are often just traps uh, visited us by the way we use language. In the chapter, what I try and do is outline three kinds of paradox. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you some examples of those three kinds of paradoxes and how they might be resolved thinking dialectically. I'll talk first about human nature, how people have different opposing sides to their character. Um, Bankman-Fried being the example of somebody who seemed to be both a hero and a villain. And then talk about strategic paradoxes, the subject of business literature, where leadership teams battle with the idea that they come up with strategies, but then find them impossible to execute. And then a third type, the type of unforeseen consequences that products like Microsoft bring to market. They look at it as something that's going to be a benefit to people, but it ends up actually complicating our lives and being a bit of a nuisance as well. What are the ways of working with paradoxes? Well, in the literature, they talk about three things principally. They talk about developing a paradox mindset, whatever that's supposed to mean. They talk about both and thinking, and they talk about polarity mapping. But there's very little literature so far on how you can apply dialectical thinking to work with paradoxes. My angle is that dialectical thinking is possibly a better way of of dealing with paradoxes than either of those. But let's look briefly at the other three methods first, and then we'll go into the examples of how you use dialectical thinking. So Mara and Spector, the problem is how we think about the problem. So paradoxes are very much mental, and it depends on the attitude of the person. How do they respond to the fact that there is a tension between two alternatives? How do they deal with that? Well, Mara and Spector would say there's three ways to do it. You can either just accept it for what it is and kind of throw your hands up in the air and just give it up. Or you could try and separate the two and deal with them individually. Or you could try and synthesize. Now, I think McGilchrist would say that the left brain's tendency is to separate the two and just to deal with one or the other. But the right brain is possibly the right is the vehicle by which people might do the synthesis. But Mara and Spector doesn't offer anything much more than that. So let's look briefly at both and thinking. The method there is firstly identify that you've got some kind of dilemma, some kind of choice between two alternatives, and then explore the underlying paradox. What does this mean to be faced with a choice? And the choice might be, should I stay with this organization or should I leave to develop my career? I have a lot of clients who face that particular dilemma. And they may say, well, there's pros and cons to both. But effectively, they're in a state of emotional discomfort. There is something that is particularly niggling about this particular dilemma or paradox. And they've got to kind of come to terms with it emotionally. So Smith and Lewis say that the both and method is about reframing. It's not a question of either or. It's simply a question of saying, well, maybe I could do both A and B. And it's about working out where that kind of happy combination is. So it's about embracing the conflict. And they suggest the first thing to do is gather some data and analyze it in terms of evaluating all the pluses and minuses on both sides of the particular choices. And then once you've done that, you can determine some kind of strategy. They talk about mules, which basically is a strategy which finds a solution that achieves a bit of A and a bit of B. Or they talk about tightrope walkers who vacillate or alternate between choosing firstly A and then doing a bit of B and then flipping back to A and so forth. But they don't go much further than that. So now we look at polarity mapping, which is work of Johnson. I forgot his first name all of a sudden. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Johnson has actually a very nice kind of metaphor. He talks about, when you think about the way people breathe, firstly there's the in-breath and then there's the out-breath. And these two actions are opposites, which are combined in some kind of happy medium. And so the process that Johnson outlines is about recognizing that there is two opposites at work here, seeing that and then mapping them out by identifying the two poles, placing them next to each other, perhaps graphically, as he has done in this little diagram, assessing the pros and cons. He puts the pros above the option. There's two here. I think he's talking about kind of attitude in management, either to be firm or to be yielding. The positives are being firm or assertive and strong. the positives of being yielding and cooperative and flexible. Or on the other hand, if you're too yielding, then you're seen as irresolute and a pushover. And if you're too firm, you're too rigid and unbending. So learning from that, having identified the pros and cons, you can work out maybe how you can be a little bit of both, how you can get the most out of being assertive and strong and minimize the downsides of being firm and unbending. And in the same way, you can maximize the advantages of being yielding by being a bit cooperative and a bit flexible while minimizing what it's like to be seen as irresolute and a bit of a pushover. Well, now we're going to turn to dialectical thought patterns and how you use those to resolve paradoxes. And usually in coaching work, I focus on 12 dialectical thought patterns because when confronted with 28, people tend to go a little bit, well, get a little bit worried. And I think Eva did some great work by pointing Lasky to the fact that actually 12 thought patterns is pretty much all you need to think through a lot of difficult problems. And these are organized in terms of structure, process, relationship, and then ultimately transformation. Let's just kind of look briefly through those. The structural dialectical thought patterns are basically using the idea that things are spread out in space, which is to say that when you look at a particular problem, there's always things kind of around it that make out the context, and therefore the idea is to take this bigger picture or this context into account. And then the process set of thought forms is really based on the idea that things are spread out in time, and therefore there's always movement from one moment to the next in whatever thing that you look at. And then the relationship thought pattern is based on the fundamental idea that everything in the world or the universe is connected in some way. And therefore it's a question of finding out, what are those connections and what is the common ground and how do things interact in those relationships. And then lastly, the transformational thought pattern is based on the ideas that everything is always moving to either a higher level of complexity or ultimately to a lower level of complexity, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. So in a way, these are actually quite simple ideas. And when they're applied to what people see as opposites, I think it gives us a powerful way for resolving paradoxes. Let's look briefly at the kind of paradoxes that leaders face in organization. Well, there was a piece of work a while back by PwC, and they looked at leaders and they said, what leaders these days, they've got to be thinking globally, but they've also got to be committed to the success of local operations. They've got to be skilled politicians, and therefore kind of pragmatic and able to do deals. But at the same time, they've got to show high levels of integrity, have a strong set of values and stick to those. And they kind of saw a tension there. And they've got to be heroes, people that others see as being particularly high performing. And yet they've also got to be meek and humble and pretend, or at least not pretend that they know everything. They've got to be strategic. They've got to think of the long term and the higher purpose of the organization. But at the same time, they've got to be able to deliver on those particular strategies. And they've got to be technologically savvy. They've got to be up to the minute on things like AI. At the same time, they've got to be people. They've got to be humanistic in their attitudes towards other human beings. And they've got to preserve what's traditional in their organization at the same time as being innovative. So quite a lot for leaders to be like. And I found that the work that Michael Apter did on reversal theory is very, very helpful, thinking about how these different sides to people, these perhaps paradoxical attitudes of people, can actually be maintained. Michael Apter, in reversal theory, says that people will move between four pairs of contradictory motivational states. Again, exactly what these states are is a little bit vague, but certainly Apter is on the same principle as McGilchrist. He says the development and maintenance of life, survival and fitness is dependent on a deep opposition between contrary processes. So maybe Apter is onto something here in that our human minds and our bodies are made up of kind of opposing forces. We have a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. We have muscles that work in one direction and muscles that work in the opposite direction. And so Apter picks up these four different motivational states, and he says these explain a lot. They explain things like, why clever people do stupid things, and why do some people take risks that they don't have to take, or why do some people go out of their way to experience negative emotions. Why do we go to the cinema, for example, to watch horror films when nobody likes to be scared, right? Why is it not possible to be happy all the time? It's because we move between these two different states. So let's look at these three case studies that I present in the book. First one is about what somebody might see as a two-faced leader. So here we're thinking about a subordinate who's thinking about their particular manager or boss, if you like. And they're reading these messages from their manager, such as, I need you to be more creative, but at the same time, I don't want you to make any mistakes. Or I want you to redo your presentation because it's simply not good enough. Or I want you to use your initiative, but I just don't want you to do things without my permission like you did last week. Or can I give you some feedback? But is that going to be positive or is it going to be negative? So leaders' direct reports have to make sense of these kind of two-faced messages or double binds in a way. And here's one way they might do it. Firstly, they might think, well, I'm competent at my job. They might see themselves in terms of a stable system if they apply structural thought form, number 12 in Lasky's schema. But then they'll notice this paradoxical conflict. Thought form 3. My boss has empowered me on the one hand, but my boss has given me critical feedback on the other. And there's a tension between those two opposites. And then if they start to apply thought form 14, again, another structural thought form or thought pattern, they might say, well, we can take different perspectives on my work. We could take the perspective that I got quite a lot of it right, but we can also take the perspective that not everything was done as well as it could have been done. And then that leads to another thought form. that of coordinating systems, one of the transformational thought forms. So what's going on now in this person's mind, that on the one hand, they see that the boss wants to help them, and on the other, that feedback is something that could help me improve. And by coordinating those two ideas, they get a resolution that the good boss is something that is both someone that's both challenging on the one hand and yet supportive on the other, i.e., they found a way to synthesize the fact that they're getting critical feedback from a boss that had actually wanted to empower them and delegate to them in the first place. So my proposal here is that by teaching people these thought patterns or thought forms, and by asking the kind of mind-opening questions that they give rise to, we can help them deal with the paradoxes that they find perplexing in day-to-day life. Let's look now at a strategic paradox. And as I mentioned earlier on, these things throw up in three different ways. Can have a discussion with the management team at the moment, that they developed a strategy, they thought about it, thought it through, but then they found themselves absolutely paralyzed because although they set out this strategy, I have a client just like this at the moment, they set out a strategic vision and a bit of a strategic plan to follow it, but they're preoccupied by the day-to-day of meeting their monthly targets. They're so scared that if they don't hit the numbers, senior management will descend on them and make their lives miserable, that they can't get round to doing the strategic things that they said they'd do. And in a similar way, another aspect of this is that managers say, we've developed this organization, we've thought our strategy through, but we don't actually have the skills within the organization to implement the strategy. And then, of course, there's the question of time. Takes so long sometimes for some organizations to actually come up with a new strategic direction that by the time they've done it, it's rather irrelevant. I think Mintzberg picked up these strategic paradoxes by pointing to the fact that very often strategy is an emergent property. Again, that's thought pattern 2. So strategy emerges rather than being set in stone from the start. So in the book, I talk about this case study with the fashion retailer Zara, which back in 2019 committed to completely getting all of its apparel made in a sustainable way, made from sustainable fabrics. And of course, that raised the difficult question, you know, if we have to be sustainable, how can we still be profitable? Because sustainable fabrics are far more expensive than the textiles that we've been using. And in order to work this out, Sora had the problem of kind of thinking through what exactly did sustainable fabric mean? What amount of clothing could they realistically recycle? What they decided to do was to open their shops, and they'd have the opportunity for customers to come back with clothing they bought previously and just dump it in the shop, and the shop would collect it all and send it to be recycled. But they didn't know whether customers would want to do this. And then, of course, they had all the costs associated with processing any clothing that was returned to them. So they'd have to repair it or donate it, and working out the cost of that and how much it would detract from the profit was quite a difficult job. And then, of course, they didn't know how much competitors would respond. whether competitors would pay any attention or whether they'd simply undercut Zara if Zara chose to raise their prices to cover the cost of going sustainable. And then lastly, they had to think a little bit about whether customers would be more attracted to buy the brand or less attracted to buy the brand. You could say that, well, we'll get onto the third case in a minute, but you could say that customers for electric cars now are in a kind of similar position. Is it the right thing to do to spend that much more money on an electric vehicle, or should I pursue, continue with a petrol or diesel-driven one? So how can dialectical thinking help people at Zara think through their particular paradox? Well, you might ask, or you might start by saying, well, we're highly profitable at the moment, but if we think forward, what possible events might occur that could affect this? And on the one hand, Zara was thinking, well, we must maintain profitability, but on the other hand, we need to invest, we need to spend money in order to become sustainable. And therein lay the paradoxical conflict, tension between two opposites, with the challenge of trying to synthesize the two. The next stage would be to think about how things are constantly moving in the outside world. Firstly, competitive environment is always evolving. And secondly, customers' tastes and buying patterns might change. And these changes could work in a positive or a negative way for Zara, but for sure they were going to change. And then Zara could think a little bit about, well, if we have to work through these conflicts, maybe actually if we can kind of overcome our emotional resistance to the idea that we're having to process opposites here, the conflicts can make us stronger and we can come out as a better organization, a more intelligent organization as a result. So starting to apply thought pattern 23, the developmental potential of working through conflict. And then developing into integrating multiple perspectives. Zara thought, well, actually, there's opportunities here because we can find new partners who are interested in sustainability, and they'll work with us to make it efficient and cheap. And we can also cut costs at the same time because we can digitize a lot of our processes, and that will save us money. So integrating those different perspectives was one way to see how they could maintain their profitability while investing in sustainability. And lastly, well, I mentioned cars already, is the case study of Volkswagen. Volkswagen have fallen on hard times. You probably heard recently about how they've been cutting production and laying off workers, pretty much unheard of for a company like Volkswagen. But in 2008, it all started to go wrong because they set a strategy to build 10 million cars annually by the year 2018. And in order to sell those cars, they had to have a design that was fast, inexpensive, and yet still green. So management of Volkswagen set their engineers a challenge to develop a diesel engine that was powerful and therefore fast, that was cheap to run and cheap to manufacture, relatively speaking, but also had low emissions. And this was reinforced by the regulators starting in California, who specified that in order for manufacturers to sell their vehicles, they had to meet certain standards for emissions. Well, in 2015, a scandal broke. What went wrong? Well, The reality was that Volkswagen fell into the paradox of unintended consequences. What happened was that their engineers uh, decided to resolve the problem of getting through these regulatory standards by fitting something called a defeat device. And effectively, what this device did was when the vehicle was stationary being tested, it reduced the emissions that the engine produced. So they engineered something that could actually detect when the vehicle was being tested, and therefore cut the emissions that, or run the engine at a much lower temperature or whatever to reduce the emissions. It turned out that this enabled them to sell something like 11 million cars that emitted more than 40 times what US standards permitted. And today, at least at the time of writing, car production was well under 5 million per annum. In addition, Volkswagen has fallen radically behind in terms of producing electric cars, and that's why Tesla stole the market for that. Interestingly enough, we're just about to see a bit of a reversal there, because it looks like Elon Musk's reputation uh, has managed to affect Tesla's sales quite significantly in Germany, of all places. So maybe there's hope for Volkswagen yet. Volkswagen ended up paying something like $30 billion worth of fines, compensation, and other legal costs in order to get themselves out of this particular hole. And the CEO had to resign. Well, how was it that Volkswagen's engineers ended up, creating this defeat device that they must have known was unlawful? And how was it that the senior leadership didn't seem to know anything about it? What kind of social or cultural conditions could have created this situation in Volkswagen where they end up completely shooting themselves in the foot? Well, here's a possible thought pattern analysis of that case. Start with a stable system, okay? A target of 10 million vehicles, progressively increasing year on year. But then we get the paradoxical conflict. On the one hand, we want fast, efficient, and clean vehicles, but the problem is engineers only know how to generate engines, or how to create engines which can do two out of those three. You can have it fast and efficient, but it's not going to be clean. Or if it's clean and efficient, it's not going to be fast. So what happened was that the engineers came up with the idea that the only solution is a device that cheats the regulatory process. And management put their head in the sand and said, we just rely on our engineers to find a solution. They're pretty smart people. And we don't really want to know too much about how they're going to go about this. So we'll turn a blind eye to whatever they do. And the engineers thought, well, we daren't tell management what we're actually up to. So let's just keep quiet about it. Now, if senior management at Volkswagen had thought for a moment that this was a possibility, they might have considered that if they had some kind of whistleblowing system, and ever the engineers couldn't face the idea of telling them that they were doing something wrong, the whistleblowing system might have been able to resolve it. And secondly, they would have thought a little bit deeper about how, given the fact that diesel engines could only do two out of the three possibilities, they might need to change technologies going forward. So on the one hand, they'd applied the idea that constant change was necessary. They needed to move away from diesel engines in the first place, as Tesla were already doing. And secondly, they had the kind of organizational culture where conflict was being prevented or pushed under the carpet, and they needed to find a way to embrace those conflicts. Perhaps having a whistleblowing system might have enabled them to do so. So if they thought like that, then perhaps they would have come up with the conclusion that they could change their strategy and transform their business, coordinating different systems to move more strongly into generation of electric vehicles and perhaps not rely so heavily on the cheap devices that their diesel engines were dependent on. So right now, just as a final point, um, it seems that the DEI policies are running into the sand. The Fortune 500 giants like Meta and Target are rolling back these particular policies. Well, part of that is the influence of Trump, so the political situation has changed. But partly perhaps it's because they see these policies as paradoxical. That on the one hand, it's the right thing to do to generate greater diversity, but unfortunately, with greater diversity becomes the tension between diverse people, and it's difficult to combine diversity with inclusion. How do we combine diversity with inclusion to ensure we have a competent, harmonious workforce? Perhaps dialectical thinking, if this was taught to organizations and managers in organization, could provide some way through that particular paradox. Okay, well, I've been going for just short of an hour. I think it's time I shut up and invited some questions. So let me just figure out how to stop sharing and come back to you.
There are so many people on the call. Please, if you want to share your question, your comment, etc., please open up your microphone and speak, or maybe if you have switched off your camera, maybe you also want to be visible. Who wants to speak? Please raise your hands, open your microphone.
Oh, thank you, Alan. I love the epic anagram there. Evoke, provoke, invoke, and convoke. Um, do you see that as dialectical specifically, or is it the tension between old thinking and new thinking that is the dialectical aspect there?
No,
Yes, and I think you're pointing there also to something that Volkswagen experienced was that their engineers simply didn't feel they could go to management and say we failed. It just was countercultural there. So leadership certainly have a big job to do in managing a culture which creates openness and safety.
Thank you, Ellen.
Well, I can't say I know the the perfect solution there. What I do is I bring a management team together, and I start really by interviewing each of them individually and capturing their thinking, and then I put their thinking together in a report, usually paraphrasing their thoughts, classifying their thoughts, pointing out where there is tensions and contradictions, pointing out where there's commonality of thought. Uh, and then what I do is I take take the report to them and get them to consider how each other are thinking and how they might resolve the differences in their thinking and how they might use some dialectical thought forms in order to do that. So I think that that perhaps answers how you might do it with a relatively small group, but not how you might do it with hundreds of managers spread all over the place, except that you have to do it in a small group at the senior level first and see if some of that is going to trickle down. I don't know if that helps at all. Well, I don't do all the thinking myself. I think what I do is try to give examples of the thought patterns, a bit like I have now, and to say, you know, if you were to think like this, where might you get to? Um, but it's up to them uh, to come up with the solutions, and I try to do it from a humble position of saying they know their businesses far better than I do, so they know what they're likely to be able to resolve much better than. Of course, if they ask me if I've got an opinion, I might well offer it, but I will offer it from a point of view of saying, look, there's very little that that I know better than you over this. All I know is how you're thinking and how you might think differently. Well, usually I do it verbally rather than through diagrams. What I will do is I'll take all the statements that I've heard and I'll put them together in a kind of group them together where I see commonalities and where I see differences. And then I'll write a commentary. The commentary will be, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I think it means, and here's the issue that I think you need to discuss. And I think it's that commentary that orients them to how they might go forward. It's hard for me to explain it more detail than that.
So you're extracting individual issues. It's clear how you do that. It's like any research with interviews. So you classify it, you structure it, and then you have like a list of 10 or 15 or 20 items. And then you don't do any particular work structuring it so that they can have a coherent
No, I don't do that for them. They do that themselves in the session where I bring them together.
Question for you. It seems that you have experience in this area. So how are you working with this approach, or what is your approach? Beautiful.
It's a lot easier to do it on a one-to-one basis than it is to do it with a group, Igor. And I think, possibly I need to figure out how to adapt your own methods for working with a group. But when I think about doing with an individual, I actually find the easiest way is to do it through a Lasky style type of interview process where you explore various aspects of their work and life. And the three houses model, which Ursula was talking about in an earlier session, is one great way to do that. Because when you interview somebody and get them to talk about their task, their responsibilities in the task house, and then you move to the organizational house, get them to talk about the strategy and the policies of the organization, and then you move to the personal house, what they want to do with their lives and stuff like that. You will be able to pick up how they think differently in these different domains. So to give you an example, I was talking to a guy coaching He's kind of a venture capitalist, investor type of individual. And when he's talking about his processes for evaluating different companies and deciding which to buy and which to sell, he's always thinking in a very complex way, in a very dialectical way, about what might be emerging, what might be changing, what the relationships are between these different businesses. But when he's talking about his work with his colleagues, his relationships with them, he's using much more simple language and more simple dynamics. So, so I could say to him, actually, you're thinking already you have a dialectical toolkit, but you're only applying it in this domain. And if you were to apply it in this other domain, think how things might change.
Thank
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think that there's a big piece around managing the emotional impact of these conversations. And I think that Michael Apter has a point, that when people are overstimulated and the frame is one of this is serious, this is about work, my career's on the line, it gets very, very scary. But when people are in a playful state, and it's fun and ideas, we're just kicking around ideas, we're having fun and we're exploring things, they can be much looser, much more fluid in their thinking. So it's a big job, I think, for a facilitator to create the right atmosphere and the right mood within the group where they can actually take on board, experiment, play with these different ways of thinking.
Nick, I have a question. Do you remember when your thinking changed so that you could yourself embrace these paradoxes?
Sorry, was that
Did
to
you
me?
share? Yes, Nick.
So I always considered myself to be a very kind of logical thinker. And I suddenly got to a point when I realized that I wasn't really logical at all. But I can't actually pinpoint exactly when that was. But I think it emerged in a conversation I had with Otto Lasky, I think would be back in about 2008. And at that point, I was still describing myself as a logical thinker. But I became aware that I didn't really know what that meant. And clearly, I was aware. I think one of the things that attracted me to Otto's work in the first place was that I was aware that the logical thinking tools that I had been taught at university on my masters and stuff like that were not up to the task of doing what I was trying to do, which is to understand people and the dynamics of people in organizations. And when I realized that, I had to go beyond, all of this logical stuff.
Else who has not yet spoken yet wants to share? Is it too personal, or would you be willing to share?
Thank you.
Who else? Okay. There is a technical note I want to make. If you are not yet part of the mailing list, so if you don't get the regular invitations, I just posted the link to the place where you can leave your email address that you get regular updates with the next invitations. Nick, what can you say about upcoming salons that you're planning?
Oh gosh, you caught me on the hop. But the next session I think is May the 7th, and we're going to hear from Harry Proctor, who is a co-author on the Dialectical Thinking Handbook. And Harry will speak about how he applies dialectical thinking in his work with family systems therapy, going into families, helping them resolve their conflicts. Was it May the 7th? Yes, May the 7th. Thank you for putting that in the chat.
Nick, I wanted to mention then another date. I think it's July 7th, and there is a salon about dialectical behavior therapy. Is this correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's Michaela Swales, who again contributed to the Dialectical Thinking Handbook, and who is an expert in dialectical behavior therapy, one of the most important therapies for resolving people with severe mental disorders. And she will talk about how she applies that, both in the individual therapy sessions, but also in the organization, in the group of therapists with whom she works. And I think that would be a fascinating session.
Wonderful. I'm very great. Nick, is there something else that you want to share? Summing up, rounding up.
Not really. I'd just like to thank you all for coming along today. I hope it was of interest and use, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.
Yes, all the best to you.
Thank you, Nick.